smack
People
talk.
thought they were going to hear a conversation about the war below, but surprise, we have bait and switched them. Now we're going to be talking about the best state in the nation,
That's
Maine.
it. Exactly. Absolutely. Well, we really are super excited to have you on here. The whole team was like really happy when you agreed to come on. And I know we've got a bunch of folks joining us today who are equally excited. So with that, I probably don't have to intro you to all of our guests that are joining us, but Ernest is a senior correspondent for Reuters, covering the green energy transition and the minerals that undergird it. He previously covered the U.S. shale oil revolution, politics, and the environment, and held roles at the Associated Press and the Bangor Daily News. A native of Maine, as everyone's heard us chit-chatting about, he is a graduate of the University of Maine and Columbia Journalism School. So welcome again. Really
Great to be
excited
with you.
to be here. Awesome. All right. So for those of you who haven't read the book yet or haven't started, I'm just going to hold it up. And I will say, like, I took out all my post-it notes, but I don't know that I've underlined any book so much since college. First of all, because I kept saying like I've got to put this on LinkedIn. But can you give folks who maybe haven't read it yet a little bit about what drew you to the topic? What compelled you to write this?
Sure. So the book is The War Below, Lithium, Copper, and the Global Battle to Power Our Lives. And it builds off of my day job, which is at Reuters, where I've been covering the critical mineral space for the past 6 years. And I primarily focused on North America, but other projects across the world. And the more that I reported on different proposed projects across the continent and elsewhere, I interacted with a lot of folks that were either before or against these mines. And these are projects that would supply the metals that are the building blocks for lithium ion batteries and for a whole host of other electronics. And I started to see folks either say, yes, we would love to have this mine here, or no, we don't want this mine here for various reasons, whether that's for indigenous rights reasons or conservation reasons or biodiversity reasons. And when you have the opposition to a lot of these projects and the regulatory, I would say, freezing out of Washington, D.C., what I started that question was, okay, where are the building blocks going to come from for this green energy transition? If we think climate change is a serious issue, how are we going to get the materials that are needed to build solar panels and wind turbines and electric vehicles? And even more importantly, every single gadget and gizmo that we use in our everyday lives now is made with critical minerals. I mean, the way we're all talking right now is through cameras and copper wiring that are powered by all of these critical minerals. And so it really, to me, brought up this idea of choice, which is the central theme of the book. What are the choices that we're willing to make if we want this energy transition, if we think climate change is a serious topic that needs to be addressed with carbon mitigating devices, and if we want to have the devices that we use every day, like cell phones and laptops and other things powered by lithium ion batteries. These items don't just grow on trees. And so the book really is an exploration of the people that live on the front lines of this tension point here. It's not a book for geologists or investors. It's a book for everyday people because it's a topic that I firmly feel really affects us all. And so that's the core thrust of the book.
I would say though, as a geologist and a mining person, like I do think, and probably there are a lot of folks on right now who are in the industry, you absolutely need to read it because Ernest, you tell the stories so well, right? Of not just the projects and the politics and the dynamics, but the people, which
Yeah.
folks are probably sick of hearing me harp on. We just don't do in our industry. Like there are real people that discover these things and come up with these crazy plans to develop them and figure out how to use this stuff in order to change the world, essentially. And like you've got to read these stories to really understand how connected it is to everyday life. And it's
Yeah,
really well written too. Like it's a great
thank
read.
you. Thank you. It was really important for me, Emily, to focus on the people that are on all sides of this debate. And
Mhm.
there's not just one side or another side. There's often multiple facets to the same issue here. And so it was important for me to really dive into that and humanize folks here that might be for a project or against a project or might be for a project for reasons that we might not even think of.
Right.
And I really wanted to bring that to the audience because I think for too long we've been so used to sort of othering people that might be on the other side of an issue. And I was fortunate in the reporting for this book to be able to spend a lot of time with a lot of the key players here and help to really tell their stories and what I thought was the best unique way possible here. That was important for me. I used to cover the oil and gas industry in my day job before I wrote about critical minerals, and I spent a lot of time actually amongst roughnecks and other people in the oil industry. I actually spent more than 2 years living in North Dakota amongst the oil wells there, and I've really got to meet a lot of people that were on all sides of the oil debate. But there, it's sort of very stereotypical when you're chronicling oil to find people that are either like really pro oil or really anti oil. Very few people fall into what I would say, a murky middle. What was interesting to me here with the critical minerals debate that I wanted to explore in the war below is that 98, 99% of people you talk to would say, yes, we need critical minerals. Like, yes, we need them for these electronic devices as well as to fight climate change, but we just kind of don't want this mine in our backyard, or we just don't want this here. So can't you get it someplace else? So rather than oil or gas, where I had a lot of people say, do we need more oil or gas? Most people I talk to for the book and in my day job say, yes, we need more lithium, we need more copper. And so the tension is around where do we get it? So that for me shifted the dynamic of the conversation. And it made it even more important to focus on the people here that are on the front lines of this choice. So by reading the book, you get to meet people that have very earnest reasons for wanting to build, say, a lithium mine in Nevada. And that tension point comes up against a conservation group that says, no, this is not the space for it. And so as the reader, you get to really walk through both individuals' journeys and discover the complexities of the situation and make for a determination for yourself. I don't really come to any conclusions in the book other than it's important to really be grappling with these choices, which I would argue is actually a very strong conclusion here, is that we need to be thinking through the complexities of this situation. Otherwise, we're going to be making the same mistakes that we made 100, 150 years ago when the petroleum-based economy took off. And so that's one of the main reasons why it was important for me to really tell the stories of the people here, because the people are the central characters here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think even especially with what some folks might think are really complicated, like rare earths and things like that, that a lot of people might not be aware of, maybe more so now, right? Because there's just been a lot more kind of normal media coverage. But it is complicated and it's very, very different from oil and gas. I think most folks are surprised at how different the industries are. Everything from the geology you work with to discovery and the way the business is set up and financing. So just wondering, like, what takeaways did you see on that in terms of how different the two sectors are, since you spent so much time in both?
Sure. I think processing is one of the main areas that I see differences there. With crude oil, you put into a refinery, and I think most people would sort of have a rough understanding that you get jet fuel or kerosene or gasoline out the other end. And with critical minerals, the processing can be very different depending on the critical mineral. So the way you process copper is vastly different than the way you process lithium. And the way that you process rare earths is vastly different than both of those. And those are just three of the many critical minerals that are used to make multiple electronic devices that are out there. And so you just begin to understand the complexity of the supply chain and the sheer need for huge infrastructure increase, which is why you've got efforts by governments in Washington and Brussels and elsewhere to help fund the development of a lot of these, not only mining operations, but what they're called midstream or refining operations as well. I mean, Emily, right now, the United States, for instance, only has 3 copper smelters. And a smelter is sort of, it's a rough analogy, but basically what an oil refinery is. It sort of helps take sort of raw copper and use it into a form that can be used in our everyday lives. There's only 3 of those. And that's a huge strategic disadvantage, I would argue, for the country right now. But if people don't want a mine in their backyard, they're probably not going to want a copper smelter either. And that's just for copper. The way you process lithium can be different depending on how you take it out of the ground. And there's at least 2 common ways right now to take it out of the ground. The US doesn't have any nickel processing equipment right now. There's some in Canada, just north of the border, but it does not have any here within the borders right now. There's no major cobalt mine.
And only one operating nickel mine in the entire
US. Yeah, right? Exactly.
Yeah.
And so this is the current reality, and this is the current situation right now. Mm-hmm. And so the book explores several projects in the U.S. Southwest, in the Midwest, and elsewhere, and helps people sort of explore through the stories of these specific people the complexities of these supply chains right now, including the refining aspect of it, because this is another thing that we have to be thinking through too.
Yeah, and I think you hit it on the nail on the head. Like if folks don't want to mine in their backyard, they're really not going to want a smelter. And I tried to make this point a few weeks ago. The Department of Energy had a critical minerals workshop out in Denver, and this big focus with DOE money on trying to like create processing capacity in the US. And it's like if you think it's hard to get a mine permitted and approved in the local community, this is going to be a huge challenge, right? Even with big government support. And I
Yes.
think it's good to also just tag in on that from a political or geopolitical perspective. The USGS released their 2023 mineral commodities summaries. Big shout out to USGS. We love them and their prospector users. But the US is 100% net import reliant for 12 of the 50 individually listed critical minerals and was more than 50% net import reliant for an additional 31 of those commodities. And again, folks who are already in the industry might be familiar with this issue, but in your view and what you talk about in the book, what are some of the key geopolitical risks if nations like the US remain so reliant on foreign critical mineral supply?
Well, we have a great example in the book of China using its control of a key critical mineral as a potential economic weapon, and that's rare earths. And the name is sort of a misnomer. They're not actually that rare. What they are is a grouping of 17 minor metals that are used widely across the global economy. What's actually rare is to find them in large deposits. There is one in California. There's a huge one in China, and there's some elsewhere in the world as well, parts of India, parts of the African continent, etc. But while the United States helped invent, or I would say helped prop up the modern rare earths industry in the years after World War II, China, the past 20 or 30 years, has essentially cornered the market and grown technologically as well as in a manufacturing sense around rare earths. And so the United States has basically let that growth happen and let its own domestic industry shrink. And in 2010, the world sort of got a huge wake-up call, I argue in the book, to China using this prowess for its benefit. I mean, it got into a diplomatic dispute with Japan involving a Chinese fisherman and a Japanese Coast Guard vessel. And the net result was that China blocked the exports of rare earths for a few months. And you can imagine a huge manufacturing economy like Japan, that signal definitely was noticed strongly in Tokyo. It also is noticed strongly in Washington, because if you can cut off rare earths exports and use that as an economic weapon, what are the ripple effects that could have across an economy? Rare earths commonly are used to make magnets that turn power into motion. So they're used in electric vehicles, because an electric vehicle doesn't have an internal combustion engine, obviously. And so it takes the power from the battery and it transfers that into motion that turns your car's tire. And in a cell phone, the thing that makes your cell phone vibrate is a rare earth magnet. And so when it vibrates, that's that. And those are two sort of common consumer examples. On a more defense level, they're used in fighter jets. They're used in laser guided missiles. They're used in night vision goggles. They're used in many, many other pieces of weaponry. And so you can see why, from a strategic and a geopolitical perspective, whoever controls rare earths really controls a huge part of the global economy. And so being able to use those minerals as an economic weapon, I do argue in the book, has given China a huge strategic advantage. Emily, we saw also last fall that the Chinese government blocked exports of other minor metals, germanium and gallium, and started hinting it could do so for graphite. It also
Right.
blocked the export of certain rare earths technology. So already we're starting to see China make moves around this critical mineral space. And right now, as you sit here today, the US has this rare earths mine in California, but that mine right now is struggling to actually resume rare earths processing. It did at one point in the past, but it hasn't for a long time. And so that mine sends a lot of its what's called concentrate, not to get too wonky here, but lightly processed rare earths to China right now for processing. And so that's a huge strategic flaw in the country's attempt to be energy independent, or at least strive for energy independence. And the book goes through the history of this mine in California, known as the Mountain Pass Mine, all the way from its discovery up into its current ownership today, and explores and explains to the reader why she or he should care, really. And I argue in the book that this is extremely important because of all the electronics that we use, many of them contain rare earths.
Yeah, and it all happened because we got a U.S. company got outbid by 50K, right?
$50,000. That was it, right? Exactly.
$50,000, and at our only operating rare earth mine. No, I mean the total bid wasn't just for 50K, but only 50K.
Right. The difference. Correct.
Yeah, yeah. For me, I remember when all of this happened in 2009, 2010, because that was when I was working in Afghanistan, running the mining exploration program over there, and it's part of why we did a bunch of work on a rare earth carbonatite in southern Helmand.
Okay.
Was because this was really starting to become of importance. Folks were already paying attention to it really at that time, but the idea being to start to identify assets in kind of partner countries or yeah, so it was a big deal. Lots of generals at the Pentagon being like, okay, is lithium a rare earth? Which are we looking for? Yeah. So it's only gotten
not technically, but
yeah, exactly. Oh, they still do that. But yeah, and I thought just a little shout out. I know one of the first quotes that I recognized in the book was from Mark or Wade Senti, I forget which one, from Advanced Magnet Labs, one of my favorite rare earth magnet producers down here in Florida. So yeah, well, shout out to the work that they do. Well, really cool. And I think, a lot of folks are probably understanding even that outside of rare earths, just with the electric vehicle market, folks might be paying attention to what's going on with nickel in particular.
Yes.
We brought nickel up earlier. And I think even folks that aren't in mining are starting to understand that China has such a dominance in the supply that they can continue to dominate by flooding the market, essentially, right, in order to lower the commodity price, at which point they can buy up the mines or buy up the product on the market at a much, much lower price, and basically essentially put a lot of companies out of business or keep them really controlled. So beyond rare earths and kind of those fancy things.
We're seeing it right now, especially in cobalt. Roughly a year ago, there was a cobalt project in Idaho here in the United States that was under development, and the cobalt market was oversupplied. The price is decreasing. Despite all that, a Chinese company that operating in the Congo, DRC, which has massive cobalt supplies, as you know, Emily, decided to increase production, clearly with an economic bent in mind, that further flooded the market, further depressed the price. And so the company developing that Idaho cobalt project essentially froze development. Right. And this would be a nice chunk of supply for the domestic United States. And cobalt is key for some electric vehicle batteries as well as other uses across the economy. But now that project is in stasis and is not moving forward, partly because of just economics, not even an economic weapon being used in terms of withholding supply, but an economic weapon being used in terms of affecting the price on the global market. And so these are things that affect supply and demand as well, that I argue in the book that people should be thinking through more as well.
Yeah, and I think one thing that we pay attention to a lot here at Prospector is, one way that countries, not just to be specific to the U.S., but since there's kind of a U.S. focus on this, can combat this is to support exploration, right? Support early stage projects so that you have a variety of projects out there so that the best projects get funded, right? If you never put money into that kind of essentially like the startup space of the mining industry, right? If you don't put money into those early stage startups, you're not going to have unicorns hitting, right? So you've got to create that pipeline. And our data on Prospector shows that currently 36% of all projects in the US are still in the grassroots or very early stage. And the book talks about the contentious nature of new projects and concerns that folks have. I wonder if you could talk to us a little bit about your experience researching the different perspectives around some of them, and what are the challenges that folks really articulated to you beyond just like, I don't want an open pit in my backyard. Like, what did you hear from folks?
I think it depends on where in the United States a proposed project is. And I should say to your audience here that I primarily focused on projects in the United States because it was important for me to have readers in the US especially grapple with this idea of choice I think too often US audiences are just expecting to show up to a store and get a product without sort of fully thinking through where that product came from. The book does look at projects elsewhere in the world, though, but most of them are in the United States. And I would say, Emily, I would put it in my answer into two buckets for you. Projects that are on US federal government land have a vastly different experience than projects that are not. And most of the projects in the United States right now are on US federal land just because most Western land in the US happens to be controlled in some fashion by the US federal government and also happens to have large mineral deposits.
Right.
And so I look at the main proposed mine that I look at for I would call it the spine of the narrative is the Rhyolite Ridge Lithium project in Nevada, which is about 200 miles north of Las Vegas. And this is a massive deposit of lithium commingled with boron. So you've got two potential revenue streams there, which makes banks and other financiers pretty happy for obvious reasons.
Yeah.
But that giant deposit also is the home to a rare flower found nowhere else on the planet. And so you can just imagine sort of the conversation.
Lithium, right? I mean, it's rare because that flower specifically grows.
Correct. We have the deposit, and you've got sort of the flower that lives on the land right above it and nowhere else on the planet. And so that sparked conversations right away with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. That and I chronicle this in the narrative, sort of explores how best to save that flower. At the same time, you've got other U.S. federal officials eager to help support the lithium deposit and have it be developed really for use to fight climate change. And so there you've got sort of one main actor with sort of many different offshoots, but basically the U.S. federal government. I also chronicle a proposed mine in North Carolina, which is just outside Charlotte. And this mine basically requires the company to buy up pieces of land, almost sort of like how oil companies have to do nowadays when they go to a new place. When I lived in North Dakota, I saw this quite frequently, oil companies, landmen coming around and sort of buying up mineral rights or actual land rights to parcels. And so it requires a methodical, structured approach to talk to several hundred landowners and convince them all to sell. And so that is a different approach there. And both of these companies I've just described are startups, are junior miner companies in the definition, Emily, that you and Prospector would have here. But it requires a sort of a different approach on both sides. And the narrative sort of goes through their particular journeys.
Yeah, and that's Piedmont, right?
Yes.
For folks to know, Piedmont Lithium.
Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. No, and I find it so interesting that you talk about like the different reactions in different parts of the world, and certainly the different stages, because as we were chatting about, as folks were joining, you and I both come from Maine, and despite the fact that folks in Maine love renewable energy and are typically really hugely supportive of anything that's positive for the environment, there is no way I can ever imagine like a lithium mine opening up in Maine, right? And
Right.
I know it's this struggle that I know I have these talks with my friends and family back home, right? Between the conservation environmentalists and kind of the need to develop resources. And it's hard sometimes not to just read it as hypocrisy, right? I mean, for me, it's like, okay, so you'd rather have it be in the Congo, right? You'd rather have all of these folks that you're worried about child labor and environmental crises and stuff. If it's over there, that's fine, as long as I can plug my EV in at my house, right?
Right.
And it's certainly not a positive place to come from when you're like, you're being a hypocrite, right? So I wonder, if you have any thoughts though on how do you think there can be some kind of reconciliation around that? How do we better navigate these questions of which places are really too sacred to develop, right? And for very good reasons in many cases, right? Of course. And I wonder if you have any thoughts on that discussion.
Yeah, I really focused hard here on the narrative and bringing this bringing the reader along to these really complex choices. I very much agree. You're referencing artisanal mining in the DRC, where oftentimes children as young as 6 or 7 can be part of the supply chain and literally take pickaxe and shovel and take rock out of the ground containing cobalt, and that cobalt would go through a processing network that would be very hard to trace. So you don't know if the device you bought came from cobalt in the DRC, and it can be extremely cumbersome and laborious to track that cobalt.
Yeah.
And I'm not necessarily saying it's a black as white. It's not that black and white. Like if we don't have more cobalt mining in the United States, are we saying we want more children mining in the DRC? I mean, I
Yeah.
don't necessarily think it's that direct. But what I really strove to do here with the narrative is to say to the reader that unless we actually want to have more production here domestically, or at least have the conversation about where we want to get it, then we have to be comfortable with the reality that there are places in the world where these critical minerals are going to be produced at ESG standards
Mhm.
that might cause us to blush or might cause us to recoil.
Right.
And if we're not really comfortable with that reality, then we have to be grappling with the hard choices of where here in the United States or North America we are comfortable with allowing these mining operations to move forward and at what standards. One chapter in the book, I explore the history of IRMA, the Initiative for Responsible Mining Assurance. And that's a mining certification standard organization. And it was important for me to explore it because it has a unique backstory. It was started in part by the former CEO of Tiffany, who, the iconic jewelry company.
Hmm.
And he realized when he was running Tiffany that he knew a lot about jewelry for obvious reasons, but he was not a mining engineer. He was not a mining CEO. He knew nothing about the best ways to mine, but he did know that he had to continue to buy gold and copper and platinum and many other metals out there to keep selling engagement rings and watches, etc. And so he got together with some NGOs and they basically said, how can we create an organization that sets the standards for the best ways to mine?
Yeah.
And they pulled together indigenous groups, labor unions, mining companies, their investors, local rights advocates, and mining industry's customers. And they put them all in the same room and they said, okay, let's get together and figure out how best to create standards for a mine. And Emily, I got to tell you, like, if that sounds like a motley crew that would be at each other's throats, like when I first heard about this, I was like, there's no way these people would ever get
Yeah.
together. But fast forward about a decade, and indeed they did. They did find a way, and I chronicle this in this chapter, to form these standards for how they feel like a mine should best operate. And this has got attention from Microsoft, from Ford, from BMW, from other manufacturers across the globe that are saying increasingly they'll only buy metals from IRMA audited mines. And
Yeah.
an IRMA audit is not necessarily designed to say yes or no to a mine, but to bring transparency so that more people know how much water your mine uses. Do you pay your people a living wage? What are the safety standards you have in place in case there's an accident? Things like this nature. So to bring transparency, because if we need more mines, if we need more critical minerals, then we need to be having a discussion about what are the best ways we can mine. And are there some places where we should mine? But at places where we should be mining, what are the standards in place? And so I think for me, it was important to bring that to the reader here as part of the narrative, because just saying yes or no to something sort of ignores the fact that life is full of grays.
No, 100%. And I think that's where, again, I'm so excited that you wrote this book because it's really only once folks start to get into the grays and hear the different perspectives, right? And the different, the detail, right? You really have to understand the detail. You can't just, like I was saying, call people hypocrites or if it can't be grown, it must be mine. Therefore, you should love us, right? I mean, it always reminds me a little bit. I don't know if you ever saw these growing up in Maine, but forestry industry is, of course, huge and folks used to have these bumper stickers that like if you don't like logging, good luck without your toilet
Oh, the
paper.
toilet paper, yeah. Yep.
Bumper stickers were everywhere for a few years, and it's like, okay, point taken, right? But still, I don't know if it really moves the needle very far, you know.
There are some people who would use leaves. So
Right, exactly.
yeah.
So people will get very ingenious. And a
Yeah.
shout out, we just did actually have Amy from Irma on our
Oh,
podcast.
excellent.
So just dropped the link in the chat if anyone wants to go listen to that. Huge fan of what they've done and agree. My thing with Irma in particular is there's all this chatter in the industry about we need more different standards. And it's like, no, there is one where they've already like gotten everyone around the table and like created this great construct. Like, let's just get behind it, and like use that
Yeah.
as a mechanism.
And what was key for me there with Irma, to your point, Emily, there are a lot of standards out there right now. What was so key for me about telling their story is that we've got a lot of manufacturers that are
Mhm.
saying Irma is the one for us. So people that are actually building the products that you and I buy are
Yeah.
increasingly saying that we want Irma certified metals to build our products.
Yeah.
And I think we're going to get to a point, my theory is that we'll get to a point where increasingly a consumer, if you buy an electric vehicle, is going to want to know what is the total greenhouse gas emissions to produce and ship this vehicle to the showroom floor. Because what's the metric you look at right now for an internal combustion engine? It's miles per gallon. I think customers are going to increasingly know, hey, like I'm not emitting greenhouse gas emissions by buying this EV, but did the lithium come from northern Chile out of a big evaporation pond facility there? Did it get shipped to the Pacific coast? Did it get shipped across the Pacific Ocean to get processed in China, then put into a cathode, then put into a battery pack, then get shipped back across the Pacific Ocean to an EV plant in, say, Nevada, before it was shipped to, say, you in Florida, Emily, or our families in Maine? And, just think of that long, circuitous, route there. I think increasingly consumers are going to want to know, hey, if going green is my way to help save the planet, I want to make sure that this product actually is green when I buy it.
And one of the biggest contributors to the carbon footprint of mined materials is the logistics, right? It's the transportation, and the closer you can have processing to the point of extraction, the less carbon you're emitting by moving low grade ore from one place to another, and then moving kind of better grade material from one place to another, right? I mean, it's a huge part of kind of where that footprint comes from. And I wonder if this might be a good opportunity for you to tee up your leaf blower story.
I was just going to actually bring that up here, because too often when I started writing this, people would talk about electric vehicles, which can be somewhat a polarizing topic, or even just sort of a topic out of economic reach for many people, just given the cost right now. For me, it was important to talk about all of the devices that we use every day that are not electric vehicles, but are still powered by critical minerals. And so a year or two ago, I got a house and decided to go all electric on the lawn care. So I got an electric lawnmower and an electric weed whacker and an electric leaf blower. And, regular internal combustion engine powered leaf blowers are 2-stroke engines. They're horrible for the environment. They emit all this sort of noxious pollutants that contribute to greenhouse gas emissions. And so a lot of leaf blowers now are going electric. But that took me down this rabbit hole, especially as I was writing this book about, okay, where did all the critical minerals come from that are inside this lithium-ion battery that are powering this leaf blower? And I got to tell you, Emily, like I got a lot of resources at my disposal, especially in my day job, and I couldn't figure out where they came from. I had no clue if the lithium took that long route I just described to you. I couldn't tell if the nickel came from Indonesia, where like whole rainforests have been dug up to extract nickel. I couldn't figure out if the copper came from Peru, where we've had a lot of farmers bitterly complain that the copper mining trucks kick up dirt and dust that pollutes their crops and makes their livelihoods untenable. I couldn't figure out any of these things. And so that's just for one lowly leaf blower. Now magnify that across the millions and billions of electronic devices we use every single day. And it really helps put in context that this situation is about so much more than electric vehicles.
Yeah. No, it's so true. And I think, to your point, I don't think folks understand outside maybe of the industry how many steps go into turning a rock that comes out of the ground into something that you use that goes into your leaf blower, or even like your makeup, or it's really just about anything that you use. And I always say, and I can see we've got some comments in the chat about like the lack of the need for education in schools about this topic and everything, and geosciences in particular, in my opinion, as a geologist. But I'm like, we as a nation need to get back to like the Mr. Rogers. Like, do you remember those episodes where he would like go into the factory and like show you how crayons got made? Like, I think in general, right? Yeah. We've kind of like totally gotten disconnected from just what it looks like. And that was one of the things that I really enjoyed about the book, were the parts where you actually went into the mines or the plants, and like you talked about kind of what the equipment looks like, what it feels like to be standing in this big open pit mine. Like, because again, I think folks don't even kind of understand what it takes to do that. And it is so different from oil and gas, right? I mean, oil and gas, my friends in that industry are going to, kick me under the table for this, but like basically you stick a straw in the ground and oil comes out, right? Like,
analogy, yes.
So it's the Beverly Hillbillies, opening scene. But, mining, it's really complicated to kind of break things down and then put them back together into something that folks use. And
I was really at pains in the book also to tell it, to your point, Emily, a story of an active mine. So several of the chapters are about proposed projects, but one chapter dives into the Morenci mine in Arizona, which is operated by Freeport-McMoRan. It's the largest mine of any metal on the North American continent. And so taking a visit there and seeing the site really helped tell the story of what a modern mine looks like. What does it
Yeah.
look like to have a company that has earned the social license to operate a large mine and has been active for more than a century and produces gargantuan amounts of the copper used in the United States and the world every single day? Like, what does that look like?
Mhm.
So rather than just constantly showing the reader the tension around proposed projects, is what does it actually look like to operate a mine of the 21st century? And so you get to, as you read that chapter, explore what it's like to see not only the open mining pits, but also the processing facilities, also the tailings dam facilities, and the facilities that make copper cathode. And so it was important for me to show that to the reader so that she or he really gets a sense of, as you say, the many, many moving parts that go into getting the copper wiring that goes into your iPhone charger.
Yeah. Yeah, it's and I don't know, if any of the folks listening haven't been able to go to a mine, I really encourage you to look for a mine tour near you or a mining museum. And Jess Scanlon on the Prospector team is a huge proponent of those because, again, I think until you see it, it's just really hard to understand what it looks like and what it feels like on both sides, where you can also better understand the concerns that people have, right? Just when you do see dust or hear the noise and all of that stuff, right? It's, again, we're always more open to discussion when we see the reality of something.
Right. And you realize there's human beings on all sides of this issue, right? It's not just sort of nameless, faceless thing. There are human beings on all sides of these issues.
Yeah, absolutely. And on that, we were talking quite a bit about the traceability. Do you think that that's going to become, you talked about the fact that consumers are going to be more and more concerned about it. Do you think that that will eventually shift into people wanting things closer to home? You know what I mean? Or how connected do you think those, will it ever get to that point?
I think increasingly consumers are going to move in that direction. I think a good analog is the clothing industry. Um, People love brands. I'm in honor of Maine. I'm wearing LL Bean. And we saw a few years ago that another company had sourced a lot of its clothing from Bangladesh, but then it
Mhm.
came out that there was a large fire in this garment facility, and a lot of people were killed. And so I think people that bought from this particular brand were shocked to know that the high-end clothing that they bought was made in a facility with atrocious safety conditions, where the workers were paid not a living wage, and some of them ended up dying in these atrocious conditions. And so you're starting to see some change, I think, in the clothing industry, with people sort of insisting on better standards for the clothing that they buy, and so they're starting to say, we're not going to buy a t-shirt made in a sweatshop.
Mhm.
And it's not a complete 180. Like, I think a lot still has to change, but I think you're starting to see it slowly in the clothing industry move in that direction. And
Yeah.
I think you'll slowly start to see it move in that direction for the mining industry as well, especially as the energy transition accelerates. And it
Mhm.
is accelerating. I think a lot of folks the past few weeks have been looking at lithium prices, and some people have been forecasting the death of the lithium industry. I mean, this happens in a commodity cycle, right? I mean, things go up and
Women-
things come
Yeah.
down. It's a reality. But what we do know is the demand projections just for lithium are skyrocketing,
Yeah.
even just this year, let alone the next 10 or 15 years. And that's just lithium. And so I think increasingly consumers are going to want to know that they're buying a product that is ethically sourced. And things like IRMA and other certification schemas, I think, will help get them there. And I think people are also going to have to think through, what are the prices we're willing to pay? Are we willing to pay more for metals produced at ESG standards that we might consider important to us? Or are we
Yeah.
comfortable buying sort of quote unquote cheap metals, not really caring about where they come from? These are part of sort of the tough choices that I really hope the book sparks, because I think we're not having these discussions right now.
Yeah.
And I argue that we should be.
Yeah. I equate it to like the farmer's market effect, right?
Sure. Yep.
At what point, do you want your local nickel mine you want to be buying direct from the nickel mine down the road, because the miners that work there, right? I've
Was there
just
pesticide used? Exactly.
exactly. Yeah, I'm like, I've way overpaid for so much honey and fruit and vegetables because it's like, oh, you're at the farmer's market, drank too much iced
Exactly.
coffee, right?
I am
Um,
with you.
yeah. Well, and I know this is a bit of a to kind of go from like that super local focus and zoom out a little bit. One thing I forgot to mention earlier was I loved like the title of the book, The War Below. And there's a lot throughout the chapters about China in particular, but not just China, but like the geopolitical aspect of this. And, do you think that we really are like in a war or a battle, to with other countries? Or how would you frame that in terms of this like, competition for these
Yeah,
resources?
sure. I think there's conflict or tension across various parties throughout the book. So you've got certainly the folks that are supporting mining projects or folks that are against them, and that's baked into every chapter. You have the geopolitical conflict here. You have the
Mhm.
conflict in Washington, D.C. and in Brussels among regulators. And then you have the tension between consumers and what are the standards that they're willing to take or willing to accept for products that are out there. And so for me, that was the broader tension when you
Mhm.
put all those together here. I mean, yes, there is a geopolitical tension going on right now between Washington and Beijing over the sourcing of these critical minerals. But there's also a tension on whether we should mine more here in the United States or not. And
Yeah.
so for me, that was the central idea here, the central tension that I'm really tapping into. And the title obviously, refers to mineral assets being under the ground,
Mhm.
hence the below portion there. But that's the broader tension that is happening right now. And I argue in the book that if we're not going to have these discussions, then we have to be comfortable, in some sense, losing the war,
Right.
and letting places that we'll never visit or never see produce the building blocks for our everyday lives. It's standards that we might not accept.
Mhm.
And if we're not going to have the debate about that conflict, about that war, then we have to be okay with that. And so for me, that's another one of the tension points here as well. And I think by humanizing this, it helps make the topic very accessible for the average reader here. And that really was my target audience here, the everyday person on the street, because I really feel that this is a topic that really affects us all. And we can't just put our heads in the sand anymore. Otherwise, we're going to lose this war.
Yeah, no, I can't agree more. And I think on that, it's about, well, we've already gone for 45 minutes, so I'll switch over to some of the questions that folks have been sending in, and please, if you've got questions or comments, shoot those in, and we can chat about them. One point that Ken made that I'd love to get your thoughts on is like,
Sure.
who out there can or would speak positively about the industry? If we do it ourselves, it just sounds like we're being like, big tobacco, as he points out. But like for someone like yourself who's kind of spent an extended time immersed in the industry, but you're not really from the industry, like who do you think should be championing this? Or how do we do a better job of enlisting allies maybe in order to be champions for the industry and the right way to do it?
I guess sort of two thoughts to that, Emily. I always at pains here to, as best I can, as best I knew how, to write a book that was fair to all sides, that really, shot down the middle, that said,
Mhm.
these are complex areas, and the best way that I know how to bring them to the audience is to be as fair and balanced as I can strive to be here. And so I was really um, proud of the way that the book came out, and really proud of the way that it's being received by yourselves and others, including in the conservation and environmental communities. So that was really, really important to me, to not say this person's a villain and this person's a hero, but to really sort of paint the landscape here, and to say, you as the reader decide for yourself where you fall on these complex issues. That was the best way I knew how, because to Ken's point, I mean, these are wildly complex issues that I think too often people have vilified one side or the other, or a third or fourth side, without sort of fully thinking through the complexities that really are baked into all sides of this issue. So that was a core focus of mine, if you forgive the pun, here in the book. What I would say though is that I think increasingly there are realizations by the average consumer that we're going to need more metals, and so they want to know more. There's a hunger for more information about how these metals are produced, and there's not that much information out there available, say on the World Wide Web or else where to actually learn more. If you're just sort of an average, let's just say, I don't know, you're somebody in their 20s who is just sort of very curious about where copper comes from.
Yeah.
And so I think more information out there would help people understand a bit more about where the building blocks come from for stuff they use every single day. And I really strove to do that here with the book, but I definitely saw a lot of people express sort of confusion or scratching their heads around, okay, well, where exactly does nickel come from? Or who produces a lot of the rare earths out there? What is a rare earth? Or even we were joking earlier that people think lithium is a rare earth. I mean, it's not, but we
Yeah.
know what they mean when they say rare earths. So I think sort of a broader understanding of the complexities of the supply chain does help. I mean, there have been, like any industry, mistakes, and the book does explore mistakes that the mining industry has made. I mean, there's no way around that. But I think more education about the mining supply chain can only help people further understand how complex this is and how important it is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And do you have any thoughts or feedback on, a lot of times folks in the industry are reticent to share a lot of information because the concern is, hey, if we put more out about what we're doing, we're just going to get protesters, right? Folks are just going
Mm.
to kind of try to shut it down. And a lot of folks, I'm not knocking anybody in particular on the call, but can be a little bit hesitant to engage for that reason. And in your reporting, have you seen maybe a better way or some of the good solution, or some of the examples you've seen in the book of groups that have done a good job of engaging and making sure to balance concerns in terms of how they're communicating?
So I would say it probably gets back to transparency and helping people understand more about what goes on in the metaphorical mine next door. And like a great example that is a sad example is the Brumadinho tailings collapse in Brazil about 5 years ago. And this was a tailings dam that was known to have structural flaws that wasn't communicated to the neighbors,
Yeah.
wasn't communicated to most of the staff. And what you had was this giant tailings dam collapse. And this was not at a upstart junior miner. This was
Right.
at an established international mining company that's been around for a very long time that has a very large balance sheet. And so that unfortunately reinforced the stereotype that the mining industry is insular, that it does nothing to actually communicate, and that it, in this specific instance, did not communicate potentially life-saving information to
Mhm.
its core constituencies. Now, I'll grant you that's one example among many, many large mining companies that are out there. But, I mean, I think sharing more information with not only physical neighbors, but communities, whether that's people physically nearby or investors or other stakeholders, can only further help to spread not only critical information, but just goodwill out there. And so, as I talk to local communities time and time again, I mean, this request for information was a core part of what they brought to me.
Yeah, and I think it's when I chat with folks, over a bourbon, it's like, we can't expect people to just magically give us a better reputation if we haven't done the hard work of actually doing better. Like it sounds really simple, but like if we want people to view us differently, we have to act differently. Which means, it's you've got to kind of break outside the box of the normal, whatever the current, kind of structure and policy is.
And there's no way around the fact that, I mean, I'm preaching literally to the choir here, but mining is a physically intense, dangerous industry. And there's just no way around that fact.
Yeah. Well, we've got a question or a comment from Mitchell. The elusive prize was mentioned in your book, referencing Energy X in particular. DLE has been seen as a game changer and an important aspect of lessening lithium costs and speeding up the process. How do you see this playing out within North America, where brine grades are marginal compared to what we see in South America? Great question, Mitchell.
Yeah.
Any
Great
thoughts?
question, Mitchell. I have an up to date answer for you. Last week I was in Little Rock, Arkansas, for an Arkansas Lithium Summit. I had started covering lithium 6 years ago, and I would have never expected I would ever go to a lithium conference in Arkansas, and yet there was 700 people there for a sold out lithium conference. The fire marshal had to turn people away.
That's amazing.
It was amazing. Yes. And so I think that that's just one state. Granted, it sits on top of the Smackover, which is teeming with lithium. And so the potential there to use direct lithium extraction is huge. The, certainly fulcrum on which that whole plan, pivots is indeed, can DLE go commercial without the use of evaporation ponds? I think we're going to start to see some success stories perhaps later this year, maybe next year, depending on how various tech deployments play out. But you've got companies like ExxonMobil investing more than $100 million into the space. Mm-hmm. Albemarle, Lilac, which recently got more money from some of its key investors as part of a Series C. And those are just a few examples. You mentioned Energy X. It has the support of General Motors as well as other investors, and it is actively looking across both North and South America. So in North America, specifically to your question, Mitchell, there's projects in not only Arkansas, but in Utah, in California, and elsewhere that are very appealing for their brine deposits. And then I think you get into the question of produced water, which is really interesting to explore. Could the oil and gas industry use the water streams that come up with oil now, and instead of paying to dispose of that, which is basically a cost center right now, could they turn that into a profit center if they can filter lithium from that? And would various DLE technologies allow them to filter that lithium at lower percentages, far lower percentages than, say, in Chile or Argentina? I think the technology is still exploring that right now, but if the potential could be unlocked there, then you can just imagine the sheer spike in domestic U.S. lithium production.
Yeah, no, that would be amazing. And I know from my folks in the oil and gas industry, that would be a huge benefit if they can get anything out of that produced water.
Nobody wants to pay for water disposal in the oil and gas industry.
I never understood until a friend of mine, Taylor McConnell, was dealing with those issues where for a while there it would get backed up. Right. And they literally couldn't dispose of it, and it would back up the whole industry. So, well, I'm getting a prodding from Jess here that folks that listen to our podcast On the Rocks know that our last question is always for our guests. If you could wave a magic wand and change one thing about the mining industry just overnight, so you don't have to deal with any of the complaining, any of the bureaucracy, what would you change about the industry? And folks, we'd love to hear your answers too.
Gosh, that's wow.
No pressure.
Yeah.
Buy your book, right? Every person in the industry would run out and buy The War Below. That's
I mean, certainly yes. That's I would highly recommend that everyone buy the book. But yes, actually, I would say that. But I would say that broadly, I think the average consumer and the mining industry need to have a conversation about the choices that, need to be made. And I think that's so important. And that's the main message of my book here is choice. If I've learned one thing in writing a book, Emily, and this is my first book, it's you get to ask your audience one question. And the question I'm putting to the audience here is, what are the choices you're willing to make? And I would say that the mining industry needs to be having that conversation with its customers, with its consumers that are out there. And sort of this dialogue has to happen. And it's happening to a certain extent right now, but it's not happening on a broad level. It's what are the choices the mining industry expects from its consumers, from everyday citizens, from manufacturers, and what about the flip side of that? What do consumers and manufacturers expect from the mining industry? And so I would say that has to be happening a lot more now. It's not happening. And I referenced my past coverage of oil and gas. When oil and gas started revolutionizing the global economy about 150 years ago, we didn't really think through some of the tough choices then. And what did we get? We got climate change. We got armed conflict about crude oil. We got a cartel that controls a huge portion of the world's oil production. And if we're not careful, we're going to be making the same mistakes that were made back then. And already we're starting to see people talk about maybe we could have a lithium OPEC. Several presidents in South America are talking about that. We've had some analysts warn that we could actually see wars over copper, which sounds sort of mind-boggling when you think about it. But this is what leading analysts have warned could be a friction point in the 21st century. And so I would say that one main thing that I really would like to see more broadly is just this broader dialogue among everyone who interfaces with the mining industry, which, spoiler alert, is all of us. Yeah. And to say, okay, what are the choices that we're willing to make here? Because if we don't think through these choices, then we have to be comfortable with the consequences of our inaction. And I really don't think anybody will want that.
Yeah. Lack of a decision is in fact a decision.
A decision. Yes. Yep.
Exactly. Right. And Yeah, and I think to your point, this it's also something that I think within the industry, we as an industry need to start thinking about the choices that we need to make, right? About how we're willing to do things differently in order to be a part of this future, right? And how we can contribute to that. So
Yes.
absolutely love that. I think, making the point that this is a choice and everybody has a responsibility to engage on it, not just abdicate that discussion and that decision to other
Yeah.
folks.
We're all in this together.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much again, Ernest, for joining us. Really appreciate it. I know you're super busy with the book launch and the tour, and congratulations on everything. And again, folks, if you haven't bought it yet, get out there and get The War Below. And we look forward to having you back on sometime soon.
Anytime, Emily. Thank you so much for the great conversation and to be with your audiences, and look forward to future talks.
Awesome. Thanks, everyone. Have a great rest of the day.
Thanks, everyone. Have a good